Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to another amazing Saturday session where we are starting day 4 of Surah Nisa. I'm so excited. And, you know, these nights have become just so precious. And tonight is extra special because we have a full house, finally, after people are out of quarantine and, dealing with COVID. And so, we were obviously not spared of, the pandemic. And it's just so nice to have people back. Although now we're wearing masks, even though the rest of the world is ready to throw the masks to the side, we are not. So, but it's we're just so grateful that people are back with us, and it's really just a lovely feeling. And I pray that everyone is doing well and staying healthy, staying safe. So I wanted to call attention to yesterday's khutbah because there are great khutbahs which happen every Friday, and then there are some that are like way beyond. And yesterday's was one of those. It was really, really special and extremely powerful. It's hard to do it justice, but I just want to call it out because it's one of these ones where, the title is How Not to Be Selfish, and the legacy of the killing of the grandson of the Prophet. There's so much in this one khutbah that stirs you to the soul and makes you think about your place in this world, and is like transformative in just over an hour. It's a reminder that, there's a small group of people, I guess, who really are dedicated and get it. If you listen to this, I can't do it justice, but these are those, it's one of those times where the Sheikh shared with us that the Quran makes it clear that it's difficult. People live an experiential life. They live their viewpoint is based on their experiences, and it's hard to get beyond yourself, and takes us through a journey of how important it is to learn how to get beyond yourself and think in terms of principle and live by principle. And as Muslims, how that is the challenge before us and how difficult it is. So on the one hand, the Quran reminds us, Shaykh reminds us, the Quran says there's a small group of people that actually can achieve this. These kinds of messages I always take as really lovely because we are a small group of people on this journey together, trying to learn the Quran, trying to take things very seriously and in a different way than the vast majority of Muslims. So it gives me comfort, but at the same time, I think if anything we've learned in this entire journey with Project Illumine is that it's not about necessarily even just who is on the journey with you. It's really about yourself and getting beyond yourself and turning inward. And, because ultimately it's just with you and God. And these kinds of khutbahs are so powerful. All I can say is if you didn't watch it, absolutely watch it. If you don't have time, I know it's hard sometimes to sit for an hour and watch a YouTube video. Every weekly email, we offer a summary of what was said, and we capture most of it. It's really beautiful, and again, it was just off the charts as far as Sheikh's khutbahs go. It was truly, truly amazing. So that, and then I wanted to just share something that I shared in the weekly email, which is that one of our Usuli friends in our community started a WordPress site. The website is usulinews.wordpress.com, and it's just to provide the links for the articles that the Sheikh references and talks about, and even the books, things that are supplemental to the khutbah. As I've explained before, Thursday nights we're usually scouring the news, taking a look at what's been happening in the world in the last week, things that Sheikh might want to comment on. And there's just so much. Obviously, we're in such a difficult time as Muslims. And so Sheikh will select from a lot of these and pick his own even, because he does his own scouring of the news, and then decides what he wants to talk about. And so some of those articles are really, obviously very important. People are interested. So, Ross decided to put together a website where we can aggregate all those links. And I think that's extremely valuable. So we'll be doing that over time. And I also shared, some wonderful independent news sites in my weekly email, which we often turn to because, that kind of news is where you get more of the truth. It's not corporate funded, and so you get the real picture. So hopefully these things are valuable. And I also just want to again call out C.J. Werleman, who really focuses on what's happening, the atrocities against Muslims, and he's been getting a lot of incredible insight into what's been happening in India. And it's just really disturbing. But, if you can support his Patreon page, I think it's extremely valuable because there aren't many journalists out there who are just focused on Muslim causes. And lastly, I just thought I would share this really beautiful message that I got, and just a little bit of it. So, Assalamu alaikum. I've been wanting to write to you for several months since the Usuli Institute has become a big part of my life since the fall of 2021. You've been with me on the bus, on the tram, on the way from kindergarten after leaving my youngest daughter, when grocery shopping, doing laundry, or making dinner. With lectures and some old halakas, khutbahs, and excerpts, I wanted to share that you have affected my life. A few weeks ago, I finally gave myself the time and space to start following the Project Illumine on YouTube. I can't seem to express in words how the pilot halakha affected me. Actually, it was the second time I listened to it, but since I was listening to it in a way I described above, walking and doing my laundry, I felt it deserved my full attention a second time. Or rather, I deserved to give it my full attention, comfortable on my couch with my notebook. But both times filled my eyes with tears of love and gratitude. I thank God for showing me the way to you in this weird social media days that we're living in. I wouldn't say that I struggled with my faith, but with my religion, and that Instagram, above all, was a part of that struggle because there is so much ugliness expressed in the name of Islam on social media. And if it is not ugly, it is just superficial. Sometimes I find something that makes me pause, like when I found your page. When I started to study a master's program in human rights, the professor's works and opinion became important to me. So far, his khutbahs inspired me to write about the Uyghurs and campaigning for this sake. Unfortunately, not very successfully, since people seem to either ignore or to be afraid to talk about this ongoing genocide. Especially, I was very disappointed that some Muslim communities just ignored me when asking for their cooperation. But of course, I can't blame them after learning also from the khutbahs how Islamophobia specifically targets Muslims engaging in human rights discourses. This is just a glimpse of the social impact the Usuli Institute has had on me. And she goes on from there. So it's just really beautiful, and just a reminder that, it's cool that, someone is saying, I just watched the very first halakha, project, Marina, Surah Hadid from last year, or actually it was 2000. Oh my God, it was 2019, actually, right? 2020. Okay, see, I can't even keep track of the time. It goes too fast. But, that people, can start on this journey anytime, and this knowledge is just so deep and so broad. I mean, after we finish this, we were doing this deep dive so quickly, but I know this is a lifetime's journey, and, it's something that can be started at any moment, and that, she said later in her message, she says she's looking forward to engaging in the rest. And I think I've gotten so many messages from people that have shared that same sentiment. So, I'm really grateful for that. And, I feel just really blessed that we can all be together, as we're going through this first pass really intensely. But inshallah, that, as time progresses, we'll have more with us on this journey. And inshallah, thank you everyone for your support. Thank you for being with us, and keep us in your prayers as we continue on. And I'm so excited for another evening of Surah Al-Nisa. Thank you so much.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحان الله العلي العظيم والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الميامين وعلى أصحابه الطيبين وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم لا تكلفنا إلا وسعنا. اللهم لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا واخطأنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به يا رب العالمين. صلي وسلم وبارك على محمد يا الله. طيب، so our journey with Surah Nisa, just as again, I always start out with a very quick summary to just get to connect and remind us all of where we are. So again, note that Surah An-Nisa starts out with um, a grand principled statement, a statement that anchors the entire moral project of the surah itself, and that you are all one, you are all equal before Allah, and but that it is not that you are all equal and therefore there is a everything goes. The moral principle that makes you all equal also commits you to a moral project, an ethical project. And as we will, Surah An-Nisa it takes on in first the specific um, micro level social reforms. So it addresses particular situations leading up to another grand principle, as we will see. But from what we've talked about, it until we left off at around verse 40, and up to this point, as we've discussed in the past two halaqas, that it corrects a variety of inequitous or unjust practices that persisted in Medina. Whether these practices originate with the Muhajirun or whether it originates with the Ansar, it really doesn't matter, but it specifically addresses a variety of practices that had produced situations of abuse where these practices, what unites all of them is that they permit or they enable abusive behavior towards other human beings. And as we will see further, Surah An-Nisa is aware that the biggest challenge is for human beings to learn a principle and then to actually implement this principle in terms of their micro decisions. So it is one thing for one to learn a principle that this money belongs to God, but it is quite another to then actually implement it in how they deal with their relatives, how they deal with people living in their household, how they deal with neighbors. And so we responding to particular situations that have to do with inheritance and marriage and the rights of even as we saw encompassing under the rubric of ma malakat aymanukum, even dependents that are animals that are live in your household. All right. There was a question that someone sent me. It had to do with the report of Salama. What I was just 32, yeah. The report of Salama that when reportedly she complains to the Prophet, and well, anyway, that she tells the Prophet, men, why is it that men have all the favors? They get to go to war, they get to be martyred at war, and they also inherit more than we do. And then, according to this report, verse 32 is revealed to say, don't begrudge one another what Allah has favored you with. And the question was, I think the person asking the question, in this report, the idea that men can be martyred at war is not seen as a negative. It's actually seen as a positive. So the way the report is constructed is they have the opportunity to become martyrs far more than we do. So it's like they get a bigger share in this world, and they also have the opportunity to have a bigger share in the hereafter. That's the logic of the report. But as I said, I think it was last halaqah, as I said, that I'm very skeptical about the authenticity of this report. I'm very skeptical that that it, as an occasion for revelation, for reasons that I explained in the last halaqah. But it is not unusual to, I mean, the report has this sort of, and this is something that we see quite often in the tradition, has this sort of stealth character to it. It appears to be, let's use the language of the age, it appears to be a feminist report. It starts out sounding like Salama is speaking up for the rights of women. At first glance, because she's saying, how come men get all the favors? They get to go to war, they get martyred, and they have twice the share in inheritance. But there are several, so that's at first glance, it appears to be a pro-feminist report. But what is the gist of the report? What is the takeaway of the report? What is the net result of the report? It's actually not a pro-feminist report. It is an anti-feminist report. Because ultimately, the response to this is supposedly God responds and says, stay in your place. Don't look at what God has favored men with. And at the risk of repeating myself, just keep in mind that the report itself then is not entirely, it's historically inaccurate at several levels. One, it is not true that only men had the opportunity to be martyred, because we know that women who wanted to fight in battles were not prevented from doing so. So at the most basic level, the most basic level, well, if you wanted to go out in a ghazwa and to actually fight, well, as some women did, and risk getting killed, there was nothing preventing you. The Prophet didn't prevent women from doing that. And some women, in fact, did. So, and if women do that and they're killed in battle, they're martyrs as well. So that defies the logic of the report. The second thing is that women don't inherit half of what men inherit in all cases. And as I talked about, it is only in specific situations. So there again, the report shows a discrepancy with the mechanics, the specifics at that level as well. Third, that these reports, there are reports that are always that bear greater levels of scrutiny, that must be scrutinized carefully in terms of both isnad and in terms of historical analysis. Isnad analysis is where you take the science of Rijal, what the various books on the transmission of hadith said about the people who transmitted the report. And this person told this person, told this person, and you then, various scholars would come to a judgment. This person is trustworthy, this person is not trustworthy, this person is forgetful, so on. But there is another analysis, and that is the historical analysis, where you use tools of modern tools of historical analysis to see if the report actually makes sense. This is another topic that we might be able to talk about, and especially it's relevant if we do the seerah thing, that the science of Rijal, the science of transmission itself, was not ideologically neutral. Who the people of Hadith declared to be reliable as a transmitter or not reliable, who they narrated Hadith from, who they accepted as a Hadith transmitter itself was not ideologically neutral. So, for instance, we notice that among the muhaddithun, and this is in Bukhari and Muslim, and maybe less so in Abu Dawood and Ibn Majah, but definitely in Bukhari and Muslim and At-Tirmidhi, is that they tended to favor transmitters who were politically pro-Umayyad or pro-Abbasid. Of course, pro-Umayyad is the most relevant. Pro-Abbasid is too late, but in most cases. But so for instance, the amount of reports that are narrated from Ahl al-Bayt is shockingly low. The amount of reports that are narrated from the companions who took part in the Battle of Badr is surprisingly low. We know that often the narrators of hadith that the state had a problem with, the muhaddithun would often avoid. This is well documented when it comes to political issues, such as who was pro-Umayyad, who supported Muawiyah, who supported Yazid, and who supported Ahl al-Bayt. But where it is not well documented is where it comes to gender issues. In the same way that the transmission of hadith responded to power dynamics of who was in power dynamics of the state, the transmission of hadith also responded to gender power dynamics. So we know that some muhaddithun were particularly misogynistic, while others transmitted reports or narrated traditions that, I mean, it would be ahistorical to call them feminist because the concept didn't exist. But um, for a variety of reasons, challenged a lot of the misogynistic assumptions. And so hadiths like the Salama narration that comes and tells us that what verse 32 is talking about is telling women to not think in terms of, well, why were men favored over us, has numerous problems when you sit down and analyze who is transmitting, who is narrating this hadith, who are the individuals that play the star role or the prominent role in transmitting this hadith to us, and because of this analysis, you are quite suspicious that this is in fact a tradition that even in fact that this entire incident with Salama took place. I mean, it might have been, and there is actually evidence of that, well, there's plenty of evidence that women were pushing back in Medina, that the presence of the Prophet ﷺ empowered women, and that various women were pushing back against Qurayshi practices and traditions. Qurayshi traditions were very conservative. Medinian traditions were far less conservative. There's a good reason for that. I mean, I don't want to take us too far away, but you're not going to have an opportunity to hear this from someone else. So, Quraysh was a tribe that relied on trade, commerce. And the logic of commerce was profit and business deals, which was clearly male dominated. And the wealth of Quraysh made the seclusion of women quite possible. You didn't need women to go and make a living. Men made the money, and men supported women. And women's role, to be very blunt about it, was basically to entertain, to be available to men who were the business class. I mean, it is very much like in the modern age when you see, businessmen that deal with women as entertainment. Quraysh had that attitude. They divided women into the women of honor, and women of honor are secluded. Women from honorable families, and women from honorable families are not to be heard or seen. And they're wealthy, and their role is to take care of their husbands and to raise the children. And women of entertainment. And they often thought of women of entertainment as the working women. But these women had no rights. I mean, these are the singers, the dancers, the pub workers, those who work in bars and so on. But they're outside the consciousness of of any right talk about rights or entitlements and so on. Medina was very different because Medina had a far greater level of poverty, and it was the traditions in Medina were such that many families needed women to work because they needed women to bring in an income. And when the hijrah took place and the habits and cultural practices of Mecca were brought into confrontation with the habits and cultural practices of Medina, the Prophet ﷺ himself clearly sided with the mobility that women in Medina enjoyed. So while some Qurayshis, well, a lot of Qurayshis, not some, but they wanted the Prophet to tell women, imitate the Meccans, do what the Meccans do, seclude women. What happened in practice was that the Prophet ﷺ did exactly the opposite. He supported the mobility of women, supported even women joining in battles, women participating in the bay'ah, women participating in shura. He would often visit and circulate and speak to women and so on and so forth. And there are many, many, many stories about this, including, the attempt by Qurayshis to get women to stop attending prayer, and the Prophet ﷺ saying, no, you can't do that. But this cultural clash, if you will, is then, when it comes to imperial Islam, who is it that comes to power and creates the first Islamic empire? It's the Qurayshis. It's not the Ansar, not the people of Medina, but it is Quraysh. And it is not just any Quraysh, but it is not the Banu Hashim, the family of the Prophet that ultimately comes to power after Ali is assassinated, but it is the aristocracy of the family of Muawiyah. And this is Qurayshi aristocracy. So Qurayshi aristocracy had wanted to roll back the practices that they believed are quite offensive in the Medina period. And among the practices that they are targeting is the mobility of women. So the state itself supported the circulation of hadith, not just hadith about obeying a ruler even if the ruler is unjust, or hadith that tell you that you have to accept injustice because it's God's will, but they also circulated and supported and backed up in a variety of ways the circulation of very misogynistic traditions, to push back and tell women, okay, now the Prophet is dead. The time where you had Abu Bakr, and especially Abu Bakr and Ali, because Umar and Uthman, it was more ambiguous. But Abu Bakr and Ali were both, Abu Bakr ruled for a short period, but Ali was the the product of the school of the Prophet ﷺ. He's thoroughly so. He was not going to support Quraysh attempting to superimpose its cultural practices upon early Islam, and he stood up to that, and he opposed and he resisted that in a very pronounced and distinct way. But when Ali died and the Qurayshi aristocracy came to power in the form of Muawiyah and the people that Muawiyah picked, we were back again to Quraysh saying, and this, by the way, also why the verse, so-called the beating verse, we clearly see clear evidence that this was never intended to speak to the discretion of a husband. Beat your wife to discipline her, if you will. But yet, the traditions that support that narrative, the traditions that tell us that, oh, after the revelation of this verse, 60 women came to the Prophet and said, our husbands are beating us. Superficially, the tradition might appear like, oh, well, it's an anti-beating tradition because they're complaining about it, and the Prophet says, well, stop doing that. But in reality, what this tradition does is that it subverts the original context of the revelation. And what was the original context of the revelation? It was a legislation to deal with a sexual improprieties or accusations of sexual improprieties that took away the individual discretion of males. So the actual original revelation did exactly the opposite. It came and said, it is not up to you to accuse and then to enforce. You have to have a judicial process. We are going to regulate it as an actual judicial process. But that was subverted. And it was subverted precisely for the reasons that I'm describing. Now, for every subversion traditions, every attempt by the state to subvert something, you will always find counter-subversion traditions. Traditions that come in and to say, okay, well, the state is clearly supporting a position. Can I work within the state and mitigate the impact of what the state is doing? And so the traditions about the beating should not be with anything more than a twig, and should not cause pain, should not cause humiliation. When you look at who transmitted these traditions, so put it very bluntly to you, when you look at who transmitted the pro-beating traditions, lo and behold, you find figures like a Zuhri or like who were clearly allied with the Umayyad political project. When you look at the people who transmitted the traditions that say, well, the beating should not be more than a twig, or should not cause pain, should not cause humiliation, you find that they were transmitters that were suspected by the state of pretending to be supporters, but actually opponents. And what I believe what was going on is that these muhaddithun that were mitigating what the state is doing. They were not willing to do what some, especially the Ahlul Bayt, did, where they actually speak out against the state and say, this is nonsense. The Prophet never said this, or this is corrupting, and suffer the consequences, because they did suffer the consequences. Or, or as a result, have Bukhari, someone who was Bukhari was clearly pro-state. Bukhari's entire history was pro-state. But and so if they took a position like that, then Bukhari is going to ignore them and declare them not reliable. So they weren't willing to do that. But instead what they would do is that they would come and they would work within the system, tempering the impact of what the state was going to end up doing. And that is why, taking the science of ilm al-rijal, the science of transmission, as is from the classical books, without scrutiny and sufficient thought, is extremely dangerous, because you are pretending that just because in books of Jarh wa Ta'dil that the such person was declared reliable, such a person was declared authentic, how can it be that people that would convert in the after Fath Mecca, for instance, who were clearly ended up supporting Banu Umayyah when they came to power, would transmit far more hadith than someone like Al-Hasan or Al-Hussein transmit. How can that be? No one was closer to the Prophet ﷺ than Ali and Al-Hasan and Al-Hussein. But yet, if you look at the number of transmissions, and the evidence is quite clear. So it is not just on issues of despotism and authoritarianism, but on gender relations. And not just gender relations, but on issues that have to do with justice generally. So why is it that, although, as we've talked about, in Surah Nisa, it is clearly telling you that those people who lived in your household as dependents should not be left to dry, that you are morally, ethically obligated to share an inheritance with them. Why is it that that was completely ignored? Well, because people of power at the time relied on help. People who worked in their households. Often these people would raise them from the time they were children all the time till, they are grown men and women. But the idea that you owe these people anything beyond the salary you give them, or the whatever allowance you, was truly radical. And so it was resisted. Similarly, as we got towards when the Quran comes and says to you, forget about attaining a level of piety unless you spend from what you love. Now, spend from what you love is not just your money. but to give of yourself from what you love. So what is it that you prize the most? Whatever it is. Allah is saying, well, if you want to get close to me, you have to learn to sacrifice that. And then in Surah Nisa, it comes and tells you that your obligation, and this is in verse 36 that we talked about, that you have an obligation to qurba, and equates relatives to orphans, and then goes on to say that the masakin, the poor, so the relatives, the orphans, the poor, and then talks about neighbors who are close and neighbors who are not close. The standard that is set is quite clear. It's saying, you want Allah, you want a relationship with Allah, there is no around an ethical commitment that involves sacrifice, because life on this earth is not the real life. And your attitude towards life on this earth is that I'm here to give. This is the way I'm passing the test. Instead of Allah testing me by causing some major trauma in my life, giving me a disease or I get arrested or, whatever, have an accident, become paralyzed. Instead of that, no, I'm not going to wait until Allah gives me some major trauma to test me. I'm going to give, and my moral universe includes all of that. But there is a reason. There is a reason that we Muslims, although the Quran says this very clearly, there is a reason why we Muslims grow up. We never hear the perspective that the beating verse was not about husbands beating their wives. It was about a very specific criminal procedure. We're never raised with the idea taught to us in our schools that you have a moral obligation to take care of your orphans, like as if your own. That you cannot fill your stomach if there are people starving in your community. You cannot remain in your home if your neighbor becomes homeless. The reason we're not raised like that is, in part, what I was talking about in the khutbah, is because that ethical project, like all ethical projects, is an ibtila. It is a test from Allah. It is given to us with the full knowledge by Allah that the majority of us will fail. That majority of us cannot meet that standard. So that is precisely why it is an ibtila. This is precisely why it's a test. And part of the true ibtila, and this is why I believe Allah tested us with the martyrdom of Al-Hussein and the plight of Ahlul Bayt, is that Allah shows us that, look, right after the Prophet dies, والسلام, in a short span of time, who comes to power? The old aristocracy of Mecca. The very people who persecuted the Prophet. The way they implement Islam, the way they is precisely what the Quran talks about when it talks about Jews and how they failed. So Allah puts us full scale. Look, the corrupting influence of the power, it's like the corrupting influence of Shaitaan. Shaitaan doesn't come necessarily and say, oh, become immoral, become a devil worshiper, become possessed by Satan, Shaitan comes and says, let me give you an alternative Islam. Shaitan comes and tells you, oh, that Islam, that's too hard. The Islam of these people, these fanatics, these companions, these Ahlul Bayt, these people, why is it that when we grow up, we are not, I once knew a guy that came to me and said, I have a question for you. Why was Imam al-Hassan such a womanizer and a sellout? What are you talking about? Well, isn't it true that he just, he sold out for a lot of money and that all he cared about was women, and that's the grandson of the Prophet? This understanding of Imam al-Hassan is a direct product of Umayyad propaganda. But most of you would know practically nothing, and I'm sure of that, about al-Hassan al-Hussein, although they were grandson of the Prophet, and although they were raised in the household of the Prophet. So of all the people, if you want the closest example of what the Prophet's Islam was, it's obvious. But most Muslims, what they know about Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, it goes through Umayyad propaganda. But the vast majority, we're never taught anything about the grandchildren of the Prophet. We skip that completely. Why? Because Shaitan comes and says, I'll give you an alternative Islam. Don't go to the Islam of these unreasonable people who live life as if they're guests in this world, as if they're living because life on this earth is just a test and they're just passing. No, be more reasonable. You owe it to yourself to enjoy this life. Let me give you an Islam that allows you to enjoy yourself. That's the greatest deception of Shaitan. So Shaitan comes and says, oh, come on, yes, Allah says, yes, take care of your walidain and dhil qurba, yes, your family, your parents, your family, your relatives. Yes, then Allah says orphans. Yes, then Allah says the poor. Yes, then Allah says the wayfarer, the refugees. Yes, then Allah says neighbors. But come on. If you're going to take care of all of that, what will be left for you? It's enough that you go to your parents. If you do that, alhamdulillah, okay, khalas. Allah will accept, Allah will understand. Don't worry too much about the rest. You see, that is the greatest. This is the way Shaitan, if the reason we have the stories of all the prophets told to us again and again and again in the Quran is to tell us precisely that people always come to their prophets and marginalize them and bracket them and insulate them so that and end up, the vast majority of people for the vast majority of time follow what the prophets say only in the most superficial way. That is why it's not a numbers game. But at least if you are going to be a student of the Quran, you have to be a real student of the Quran. The Quran is not like every ethical project. It requires commitment and seriousness and sacrifice. Now, notice when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then is talking about, this is in 37 and 38, الَّذِينَ يَبْخَلُونَ وَيَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبُخْلِ. Those who are stingy and teach people stinginess, and those who spend their money, this is in 38, and those who spend their money in ri'a'in nas, those who spend their money in order to show off. Take notice, Allah is not talking about some remote, faraway society. Allah is talking about Medinian society. So you have to understand that at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were Muslims who did precisely that. The Quran is pointing the finger not at kuffar, but at Muslims. Muslims who would not want to spend, Muslims who would spend, but they're spending because of social prestige and social image, not because of conviction. And it is no small matter that Allah alerts us that for you could be Muslim, but because of your relationship to the morality and ethics that Allah demands of you, that your qareen, وَمَنْ يَكُنُ الشَّيْطَانُ لَهُ قَرِينًا فَسَاءَ قَرِينًا, that your companion becomes shaitan. Your qareen. The qareen is like something that is stuck to you. As we will see, the greatest portal to shaitan is tazkiyatun nafs. Is when you think of yourself as, well, I'm fine. I'm not a bad person. Or, and in gradations. The more you, instead of holding, it's like two types of students, right? There's a student who gets their grade and says, I can always do better. Every time they get their grade, they say, next time I'm going to work harder to get better results. And a student who, whatever they get, they say, oh, that's great. It's good enough for me. It is not a surprise that the second type, the one who's always say, well, whatever I get, that's fine. It's not a surprise that they're usually, well, not more than usually, nearly always, is not the stellar student. It's a student who's satisfied with, passing. This is the attitude of tazkiyat al-nafs, as we will see in Surah Nisa. When Allah says, لا تزكوا أنفسكم. We'll come to that. Okay, and then we left off at, because I think I remember telling you the story of the Prophet ﷺ crying when he gets to when Surah Nisa is being recited, and then he gets to verse 40, was it 41? Yeah, 41. That this Surah Nisa comes back again and reminds us of the role of Shahada. That bearing witness. And by then, as we saw, the idea of your moral role is to be a witness for God against yourself and against others. A witness for God in every sense of that sort of theological moral construct has already been firmly established, because as we saw, it featured in Surah Al-Baqarah, it featured in Ali Imran, and then again Surah Nisa in 41, that Allah reminds us of that essential moral function. All of us are being witnessed and are witnessing constantly. All of us, ultimately, there are those who will testify for us or against us, as we will testify for or against others. And to understand that it's a complete change in paradigm, right? Because if you think I am on this earth, and in everything I say and everything I do, ultimately, there are those who will testify for or against me, and I pray to God that if their testimony is against me, that it is not a just testimony, because you want the testimony, if it's against you, to be not a just and not a fair testimony, because if it is, you're in trouble. As I will testify for or against others. Why is it a paradigm shift? Because it changes your entire attitude about everything you do and everything you perform. This has been, by the way, a constant theme when the Battle of Karbala is fought and Imam al-Hussein and all his supporters are martyred. What does the women folk who survived, the only survivors of the Battle of Karbala were women and children. And a lot of the children were killed, but the children who did survive. But what do they say? The comfort to that who has suffered injustice is what vindicates me, or what gives me comfort, is that I will bear witness against you in the hereafter. Fast forward to the modern day, in every trial in which judges are sentencing political opponents to death. This is in Egypt. Or vindicating people who tortured prisoners, or sentencing people who were tortured and abused unjustly to prison and so on. What is their constant response that you hear time and time again? It's the same thing. That what gives me comfort is that I will testify against you in the hereafter. And what is remarkable is that when you look at the rhetoric of this testimony throughout Islamic history, that, okay, fine, but notice, today you are persecuting me. Well, tomorrow in the hereafter, I will prosecute you. That I will be your khasim. Ana khasimuk. That I will ultimately, is the the dynamics of this is that the state, unjust states, from the dawn of Islamic history till today, go to great lengths to silence. They hate that part. So, in Egypt, initially Egypt was allowing cameras to come in when they were sentencing political opponents to death and to life in prison. And often political opponents would start screaming at the judge or families of opponents, "We will testify against you in the hereafter." The Egyptian state not only arrested the family members who said that, but stopped broadcasting. When you look at these dynamics, they remind you of every incident since the Umayyad period till today, in which the state is acting as a tyrant and someone is suffering an injustice. The idea that you exist on this earth at all times, in everything you say and everything you do, you are either being witnessed for or against, and you in turn are going to witness for or against others, is an extremely powerful idea. But we're not raised with it, although it is anchored in the heart of the Quran. And we're not raised with it, again, because the authoritarian state found this idea extremely destabilizing. How can you rule and subjugate and dominate a people who think not, instead of thinking of themselves as lowly, worthless human beings, they think of themselves as witnesses for God? It's an extremely empowering idea. So the state can't afford that. And so throughout Islamic history, the state, throughout Islamic history, has gone to great lengths, but if we can understand it in the medieval time, it's a tragedy for the modern times. Because people are supposed to mature and grow and progress. So even in medieval times, people couldn't rise up to the Quranic standard of being, their worth, their dignity as human beings is that they are bearing witness for God. The Quranic potential is incredible because it is a universe of morality and a universe of empowerment. Okay. And of course, 42, يومئذ يود الذين كفروا وعصوا الرسول لو تسوى بهم الأرض ولا يكتمون الله حديثا. I'm not going to say it's self-explanatory that you ignore this charge of bearing witness and this dynamic of witnessing for or against at your own risk, because in the hereafter, when you are looking back at your life and you're looking at all the times where you did not take into consideration what the testimony in the hereafter, whether it's for or against you, is going to be, and especially what the testimony of your prophet is going to be. And that's the part that's really scary. Maybe, I'm not sure, I can bear the testimony of all types of people, but the idea of the prophet ultimately just, even if the prophet is just disappointed so that I don't come to the prophet's attention. Like, for instance, this guy, he's such a disappointment. Don't worry about him. It's okay. No, he's not one of the close ones. I want to be one of the people that the Prophet says, oh, he's as if it could my companion centuries after I died. That's the status you want. You want the Prophet to say, bring this person to me, companion. But again, we're not raised with that. Although I could tell you stories about how that paradigm itself, the idea of what the Prophet's testimony will be about you, and whether you will be you have a possible way of being one of the close ones, or you're going to be one of the completely ignored ones, the ones that among the multitude that just don't have a prayer of even getting a whiff of his scent. Although it's a very powerful construct, and I mean, and for people who are raised with it, I can tell you it's a motivation that sustains you through the hardest times, because it's okay. I still can be close to him. It's okay. What I'm going through, I'll endure if it brings me close to him. Just being within reach of him. And yet we ignore that. Yet again we leave that out and yet again, because it's extremely empowering to the Muslim individual. It's extremely empowering to the Muslim individual, men and women. Okay, let's take a short break. Okay, just 3-minute break. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So now, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى حتى تعلموا ما تقولون ولا جنب إلا عابر السبيل حتى تغتسلوا وإن كنتم مرضى أو على سفر أو جاء أحدكم من الغائط أو لامستم النساء فلم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا صعيدا طيبا فامسحوا بوجوهكم وأيديكم إن الله كان عفوا غفورا. So 43, of course, what's the most famous for is that the first part of the ayah, that don't لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى, don't even attempt to pray if you are intoxicated, so that you will know what you are saying. And then the other legislation is about purification. And there is, let's see how translates this. And there is this debate, which we don't need to get into, about in لامستم النساء. Muhammad Asad translates it as or have cohabitated with a woman and can find no water, then take resort to pure dust, passing therewith lightly over your face and your hands. Behold, God is indeed the absolver of sins and much forgiving. There's a juristic debate that we don't really need to get into as to what does lamestum nisa mean. Is it talking about wudu and you've touched women even without desire, or is it talking about purification as after cohabitation, as Muhammad Asad puts it? Muhammad Asad is probably right. It is referring to cohabitation because of the etymology of lamastum itself, and the usage in Arabic at the time. But so the part that we should comment on, the regulations as purification and if there's no water, so you use dust and tayammum and so on. These are all technical matters that we don't need to get into. لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى. Don't pray if you are intoxicated. Normally, what most people learn is that most Muslims, especially in this day and age, is that this was the first stage in prohibiting alcohol. So that first, the first legislation comes and says that um, don't, if there is a risk that you are going to be intoxicated, and when it comes time for prayer, then make sure you're not. So, in which, considering that you pray 5 times a day, then that leaves a very limited period of time to be actually to drink to the point that you're actually intoxicated, and that then later on alcohol is the prohibition against alcohol is total, and in that it says that it is amalun, that it is rish, min amalu shaitan, it is something evil from and satanic, and so avoid alcohol altogether. And normally, so according to this approach, then you'd say that this part of this ayah has been abrogated, because if alcohol is forbidden altogether, then the reference to sakara, the reference to being intoxicated in prayer, is no longer valid. It has no application. It is quite true. I think it is, to my mind, it is beyond dispute that alcohol was prohibited in stages, although it is, even by the we're talking now about the third year hijrah. The evidence is rather cumulative that even by the third year hijrah, Muslims already knew that the Prophet never drank, that the Prophet always looked at drinking as something unbecoming, unethical, and it troubles me to think, or it's just not persuasive to me, that the Prophet ﷺ doesn't drink, and the Prophet ﷺ in a number of traditions before the revelation of this ayah is telling people that alcohol, the reason he doesn't drink is that alcohol is something that's shaitani. And that the idea that people will just continue drinking, mind you, it is true that there are a lot of people that only converted to Islam nominally, and that because they converted to Islam nominally, following the Sunnah of the Prophet was not something, not a priority to them. But when you are talking about the close people to the Prophet ﷺ, the prominent companions, and figures like Ali bin Abi Talib, for instance, or Abdurrahman ibn Auf, or these figures who are quite close to the Prophet early on, the idea that they would continue drinking, although they knew from, if they're muhajirun, from the 10 years in Mecca, how the Prophet ﷺ feels about drinking, the idea that this would just continue, I find not convincing. There is a tradition narrated, or let's put it this way, attributed to Ali bin Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, that says that Abdul Rahman ibn Auf invited them to have a meal at his home, and that Ali ibn Abi Talib and a number of the companions went to have this meal, and that then Abdul Rahman ibn Auf served alcohol with this meal, and that they ate and drank, and then when it came time to prayer, that Ali bin Abi Talib was the Imam in prayer, and that he read قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ, and that because of the influence of alcohol, because he was intoxicated, he messed up the surah completely. And this narration tells us that this is after this incident is when this verse was revealed. This is a good example of one of the of a class of traditions, class of ahadith that, and this is why in the introduction I was talking about the pro-Amawid muhaddithun and so on. A class of ahadith that surreptitiously seem to want to malign Ali bin Abi Talib. Because when you look at the transmitters of hadith, what is very prominent in the chain of transmission in this hadith is key figures who, one of the figures, for instance, is reported to have actually fought against Imam al-Hussein in the Battle of Karbala. Now, for the muhaddithun, the fact that someone fought on the side of Yazid in the Battle of Karbala against al-Hussein doesn't discredit their credibility. In my book, it's a disqualifier. But in a more sophisticated approach, and also in my book, it makes me look very carefully at the substance of what is being transmitted. And so the idea that someone who's so close to the Prophet ﷺ, we have other transmissions from other venues that tell us that Ali bin Abi Talib wouldn't drink at all. That, like the Prophet, he refused to come close to alcohol. And here this tradition tells us that, he got intoxicated and that he was served alcohol by no less than Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, and that he got so intoxicated that he messed up in reading قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ in prayer, and read it, in fact, to be the opposite meaning, because in the report it tells us that the way he read it, it's actually to convey exactly the opposite of what the surah says. It seems like a genre of traditions that, again, that comes from an Amawid line in order to malign Ali. Why am I saying all of this? Because there is an understanding of this verse that, yes, it is saying to people, not to the people like Ali bin Abi Talib, and not to companions that literally, had spent many years with the Prophet ﷺ, but it is talking to all these Muslims who had converted, were new converts, and who were going to continue drinking until drinking is, strictly banned. And so, yes, it's saying to them, just understand that it is not acceptable that if you are intoxicated in prayer, which is a point that for the older Muslims, the more seasoned Muslims, is obvious. But al-Dhahak, early authorities on the Quran like al-Dhahak and an early authority like Ibn Abbas tell us something about this verse that modern Muslims are not accustomed to hearing, and that it was understood as saying more some even, like Ibn Abbas said, that it's not talking about alcohol at all. He went even a step further. But that any state of sukr, now sukr in Arabic is not just being intoxicated because of alcohol, but being mentally not present because of any reason whatsoever. So we talk about sakratul maut. Sakratul maut, the sukr of death. Why? Because when you're dying, you're not mentally present. We also talk about sakratul naum, that you're not mentally present because you're sleepy. So the Haqq is saying that what this verse is telling us is make sure that when you pray, you are not in a state of absent-mindedness because of any of the things that cause you to be absent-minded. Al-Dhahhak says an-nawm, and Ibn Abbas says an-nu'as, but what they're saying is that especially being sleepy, that don't, make sure that arrange your life so that you're not praying when you are sleepy, so you're not paying attention to what you're saying, or exhausted, so that you're not paying attention to what you're saying. And this is where you find these traditions, because commentators on this understanding of the verse go on to say that anything that is analogous to a state of sleepiness or a state of exhaustion, like you should, what Allah is telling you is to make a deliberate effort to get into the habit of paying attention when you pray. So make an effort to not be absent-minded, because a state of sukr, you could be absent-minded because you're thinking of financial matters. You could be absent-minded because you are bothered about whatever. And from that perspective, suddenly, to say that this ayah is abrogated is meaningless. And that ayah then becomes very present and very pertinent to our lives, because it is teaching us to make a deliberate effort that when we pray, we fight against anything that would make our prayer absent-minded. It is rather remarkable. I mean, I think, again, it's remarkable that we don't raise our children with this understanding. Although it's, there's also other reports that the way that people understood this legislation is basically, be mentally present in prayer, and that was the absent-mindedness. All states of sukr in prayer is to be resisted. Okay. Then in Surah Nisa, at this point, Surah Nisa then shifts to talk about okay. So first, 44. ألم تر إلى الذين أوتوا نصيبا من الكتاب يشترون الضلالة ويريدون أن تضلوا سبيلا والله أعلم بأعدائكم وكفى بالله وليا وكفى بالله نصيرا. And then it talks about ومن الذين هادوا يحرفون الكتاب. Okay, so it shifts gear and it will talk about what, as we saw in Surah Al-Baqarah, like Surah Al-Baqarah, which contains a mixture of law, but then talks about people who received the message before us and what they've done. Similarly, in Surah An-Nisa, we see the same type of methodology, where it talks about law, but then it shifts gear where sometimes it is quite explicit, where it talks about, it explicitly says Jews or Christians. But other parts, what the target of the ayat could be Jews and Christians, but could also be Muslims who received the Quran at the time. So look at 44. Let's see how Muhammad does it. Okay. So 44, Muhammad Asad says, art thou not aware of those who, having been granted their share of the divine writ, now barter it away for error and want you to lose your way? الذين أوتوا نصيبا من الكتاب, those who have received a part of, Muhammad Asad says divine writ, a part of the revelation, a kitab, the revelation. Well, obviously it could be talking about Jews and Christians, but it can also be talking about Muslims who received part of the revelation, because as we will see, Surah An-Nisa focuses on one of the biggest challenge for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and that's the challenge of hypocrisy. And later on, the Quran will dedicate an entire surah to the problem of hypocrisy. But what is the actual real problem at the time? This is the biggest challenge. Yes, there's a circle of people that are devout converts that are learning very closely what the Prophet ﷺ has to say. But then with the outer circles in gradations are various people who converted in the most nominal way, people who say they're Muslim but continue to plot and plan with the Jewish tribes in Medina, people who say they're Muslim but continue to have behind the scenes relations with Mecca itself and convey, in fact, are effectively sort of like spies for Mecca, because they relate everything that goes on to Medina to the Meccans. Their financial interests, their business interests are with Mecca, and so that's where they are. People who find the Islamic project burdensome and they want to go to the old ways, whatever their the old way of living, which was full of alcohol and prostitutes and raiding caravans and highway robbery, and it just the equivalent of a fun life, a life full of excitement, rather than a life that is about prayer and contemplation and sacrifice. And the point of the magnet for them are key figures like Abdullah ibn Ubay, someone who was known as the head of the hypocrites, at least for the I believe it was the tribe of Khazraj. There is also a head of the hypocrites for the tribe of Aus. His name right now escapes me. But remember that everything that the Quran says or tells us about Jews and Christians, it tells us to warn Muslims. And so there's a very good reason why Allah is, and you'll see this in a second, where sort of you're talking about Jews and Christians, but at the same time there are various parts where in the midst of that Allah talks about the hypocrites. And so the entry to sort of like to shift gears, as we saw in Surah Al-Baqarah, to talk about the mistakes of the past, the penultimate statement is, listen, it is not the receiving the revelation, and as we will see in a second, I mean, I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but that this is a moral, ethical project. You either commit yourself to it completely or you corrupt it. What you do not do is fall in the trap of hypocrisy by saying, well, I'll do of it what I like. And what is even worse is that those wishy-washy people, those people who are not people of commitment, not people of sacrifice, those people who want to, take little parts of it, do whatever is convenient and so on, they are unhappy with you as committed people because you bother them. You are a threat to them, and they want you to be like them. And you have to understand that. And that is why وَيَشْتَرُونَ الضَّلَالَةَ وَيُرِيدُونَ أَن تَضِلُّوا سَبِيلًا. أن تضلوا السبيل, not تضلوا السبيل. أن تضلوا السبيل. That they want you to go astray. Okay. And that Allah, وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ بِأَعْدَائِكُمْ وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ وَلِيًّا وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ نَصِيرًا. That in truth, you don't know who your enemies are. This is historically, the statement is extremely impactful because Muslims at the time, they are surrounded by people who say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. They will even go out to battles with them. But what their motivation, it could be that their motivation for joining Muslims in battle is spoils of war. Traditional Arab motivations, not because as we will see, not because of anything that has to do with Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ himself, the immigrants are confronting a considerable amount of social ostracism because of all the burdens they brought upon Medinian society when they immigrated. But the Ansar, those who supported the immigrants, are increasingly coming to terms with the fact that they are committed to helping these these people with an entire moral ideological project, but so many of their fellow countrymen, so to speak, are not similarly committed and are critical of the Ansar because of their commitments. Okay. من الذين هادوا يحرفون الكلمة عن مواضعه ويقولون سمعنا وعصينا واسمع غير مسمع وراعنا ليا بألسنتهم وطعنا في الدين ولو أنهم قالوا سمعنا وأطعنا واسمع وانظرنا لكان خيرا لهم وأقوم ولكن لعنهم الله بكفرهم فلا يؤمنون إلا قليلا. let's take 472. يا أيها الذين أوتوا الكتاب آمنوا بما نزلنا مصدقا لما معكم من قبل أن نطمس وجوها فنردها على أدبارها أو نلعنهم كما لعنا أصحاب السبت وكان أمر الله مفعولا. Okay. And 48. إن الله لا يغفر أن يشرك به ويغفر ما دون ذلك لمن يشاء ومن يشرك بالله فقد افترى إثما عظيما. So let's, in interest of time, let's look at the translation. Okay. So 46. Among those of the Jewish faith, there are some who distort the meaning of the revealed words, taking them out of their context, and saying, as it were, we heard, but we disobey. And hear without hearkening, and hearken thou unto us, Muhammad, thus making a play with their tongues and implying that the faith is false. And had they but said, we heard, and we pay heed, and hear us, and have patience with us, it would indeed have been for their own good and more upright. But God has rejected them because of their refusal to acknowledge the truth, for it is in but few things that they believe. All you who have been granted revelation, believe in what we have now bestowed from on high in confirmation of whatever of the truth you already possess, lest we efface your hopes and bring them to an end. Just as we rejected those people who broke the Sabbath, for God's will is always done. For verily God does not forgive the ascribing of divinity to aught beside God, although God forgives any lesser sin unto whomever God wills. For he who ascribes divinity to aught beside God has indeed contrived an awesome sin. Okay, so first, for 46, the narrations tell us that we understand, as I've noted, that there is a close alliance between the hypocrites or people of various degrees of hypocrisy and the Jewish tribes. And the Jewish tribes are emboldened by the local opposition, i.e. the hypocrites of Medina, who there are an opposition group from the Aus and an opposition group from the Khazraj to the two main Arab tribes living in Medina. And what is reported in the tradition is that they would mock the Prophet ﷺ by playing with words. So they would say, I'm going to say it in Arabic. Isma ya Aba Qasim. So they would call upon the Prophet and utter a form of the word isma or asma, depending on the narration. Either they would tell the Prophet, asma, tell us, we're listening to you. If they say isma ya Abu Qasim, listen, they're telling the Prophet, you listen. But they would laugh and giggle and chuckle afterwards. Um, the inside joke, so to speak, is they then would, jab each other in the side and say, لا سمعت. So, اسمع يا أبا قاسم لا سمعت. This is a sort of a cheesy inside joke, because what you're saying is, oh, we're listening to you. Abu Qasim is father of Qasim, the Prophet's son, another means the Prophet Muhammad. So, oh, we're listening to you, Prophet Muhammad, but then the la samat, meaning may you lose your hearing, may you never hear anything. So, in other words, they're twisting words to mock him, to put him down, and they have these inside jokes that has become part of the counterculture among Jewish tribes and the hypocrites. They're creating these inside jokes by which they are mocking the Prophet and his followers. And another rude inside joke, so to speak, is where they will tell him, Ra'ina. Now, Ra'ina could mean listen to us, and it could mean be patient with us, and it could mean an insult. You're accusing someone of ru'una. Ru'una means being stupid, lightweight, unintelligent. So they would use these phrases. So they would go to him and say, Ra'ina ya Muhammad, Ra'ina ya Muhammad. And they would then chuckle and giggle that what they meant by it is to insult the Prophet, while they would appear, what then if someone says to them, well, are you insulting the Prophet? Say, what do you mean we're insulting him? We're just saying, be patient with us, that's all. And so the Quran comes and it, for the historical context, is that the Quran comes and it confronts this and says, well, God knows your inside jokes. You think that, you have this counterculture going on that is shared by your members only. Well, God sees through it, and God talks about it. But then there's a sort of a little thing worth noting. ولو أنهم قالوا سمعنا وأطعنا واسمع وانظرنا لكان خيرا لهم. If they would have said, give us time, if they were sincere, and instead of playing with words and jeering and mocking and laughing, they would have genuinely asked the Prophet to give them time to reflect and consider what his role is, his message is, that would have been, in fact, good for them. So it's basically comes and says, Allah knows that you're not you are a lot of what you are displaying outwardly is a systematic and a consistent way of lying about your true intentions towards this prophet. Okay. Now, this culture of when, although the Quran directs its criticism against Jews in this context, it is what it is targeting is it's sort of a certain attitude of, instead of dealing with the weighty and burdensome moral and ethical ideas that the Prophet is bringing to in Medina and that Muslims are laboring with, this sort of culture of, well, let's not take seriously any of it, and let's not talk seriously about any of it, and let's just turn it into laughing material. So that's one. "47, I like the way that Muhammad Asad translates it, because the way he translates it is, lest we efface hopes and bring them to an end. A lot of people come to this ayah 47, and the way they translate it, يا أيها الذين أوتوا الكتاب آمنوا بما أنزلنا مصدقا لما معكم من قبل أن نطمس وجوها فنردها على أدبارها. They come to it and they translate it very literally, and they say, oh, it's saying, people of the book, believe in what we've sent, which actually confirms much of what we've sent you, before we come to faces and turn it backwards. And then you get these traditions that tell you, oh, well, this is because in the hereafter, people who have denied the truth, they will appear before God with their heads turned backwards. So instead of looking forwards, their faces will be looking backwards. So your neck will be twisted around. None of these traditions are reliable or authentic by any measure. And what Muhammad Asad's translation takes the idiomatic understanding. When you say فنردها على أدبارها نطمس وجوها فنردها على أدبارها, what it means is that it's an idiomatic expression that before the time comes where wishful thinking, where hopes, pipe dreams, what we would call pipe dreams, will be dashed. It's an idiomatic expression. To translate it literally is nonsensical. And before the time that all these, when people are live in a bit of a delusion, and the delusion is they jeer and mock and laugh. They all feed onto each other. When you are all in a mocking attitude, you are all empowering each other. And quite often, the way you can mock others, the way you can mock the truth especially, is by not thinking very hard about anything, but living a pipe dream, saying, oh, we are so confident that we are all right, quite irrationally and quite without thought. You are all feeding into each other's ego trip. And so what Allah's saying is, listen, you're not, Allah knows that you and the hypocrites, you and your supporters, have turned this into an occasion for mockery and laughter and so on. But the time will come where, quite literally, your faces will fall, will crash in disappointment. Because all your pipe dreams that you've imagined that you've got this under control will come to a crushing blow. Okay. Then 48, which is probably of the Quranic revelation, one of the most impactful verses in the Quran, because it has had an enormous impact on all types of movements in Islamic history. Unfortunately, like 48 has had an enormous impact, for instance, on the way Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab understood Islam, and the way his whole aqidah is, in many ways, a lot of the way Ibn Taymiyyah's theologies relies, again, on. But it is really dangerous to understand 48 to take it without paying attention to what comes before it and what comes after it. You can't pluck an ayah of the Quran outside, as if, you're taking it out of its water. You must understand it in the context of his discourse. So, okay. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرَ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ. So Allah doesn't forgive associating partners with God, or Allah doesn't forgive shirk. But Allah could forgive what is less than that to whomever Allah wishes. And then وَمَا يُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ فَقَدْ افْتَرَى إِثْمًا عَظِيمًا, because anyone that engages in shirk engages in a grave sin. إِثْمًا عَظِيمًا. But you can't stop there. You have to see what comes after. Okay. أَلَمْ تَرَى إِلَى الَّذِينَ يُزَكُّونَ أَنفُسَهُمْ بَلِ اللَّهُ يُزَكِّي مَن يَشَاءُ وَلَا يُظْلَمُونَ فَتِيلًا. Don't you see those who commend or praise themselves? It's a continuing idea. Don't you see? Haven't you seen? Haven't you noticed those who commend themselves? In truth, this issue of who's praiseworthy only belongs to Allah, and Allah doesn't commit an injustice. Now, but you go on. انظر كيف يفترون على الله الكذب وكفى به إثما مبينا. Look how يفترون على الله, al-iftira Allah, those who lie about God. يفترون على Allah, what is it that how is it that they transgress about God? على الله كذب, they are lying about God. وكفى به إثما مبينا, and lying about God is truly a grave sin. So the shirk here it is not just shirk, meaning worshipping idols. Notice the context. After Surah Nisa talked about various legal matters, then it comes to those who are receiving the book, but they're not serious about it. They take the book and they take it in part. And then it gives us an example, and every time Allah gives us an example about past nations, Allah intends this as an education, as a lesson to us. And Allah talks about a specific situation in which there are these people who, among the Jewish tribes, but we also know that they are, the problem is that they have created these cultures with the hypocrites, where they are not taking, or they are trying to make light of what the Prophet ﷺ has brought, and they are mocking and jeering and laughing and so on. So, what is the problem with a lot of the people who are able to look at what the Prophet ﷺ, what Muhammad ﷺ is doing, and to look at people like Ali bin Abi Talib and like Abu Bakr and like Umar, and to look at these dedicated Muslims who are sacrificing everything, people who are, entirely committed, and they look at all of that and they just not buying into it. Or what is the problem? The problem is tazkiyatun nafs. The problem is that when all is said and done, they say, we're okay, we're not bad people. What's wrong with the way we are? You see, this is relative. You might think, if I frequented prostitutes, I wouldn't think that I'm okay. But you know what? That's relative, because someone else would say, well, I'm nice to these prostitutes. I give them good money. And, I have a kind heart. I actually never beat any of them. I don't insult any of them. What is this whole thing about these Muslims and, you have to, I pay my servants much better than everyone else. And what is this thing about Muslims saying they're entitled to this, or you have to marry slave girls, or, what is this thing about, we are fine. That's the tazkiyatun nafs. The Jews who mocked the Prophet, they didn't say, let's engage in an evil project. They thought, we are morally fine. We're okay. Why is he making such a big deal about usury? And why is he making such a big deal about fighting the Meccans and the rights of the poor? And, this is extremism. This is too much. We are fine the way we are. What does Allah describe this attitude as? يَفْتَرُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبٍ. You are lying about God. What I said in the khutbah yesterday, most people, vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, they project their experiential knowledge upon principles. So the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, this is what I was talking about in the khutbah, that they don't want to pause very seriously about what truly God wants or doesn't want. They want to project unto God whatever they are, whatever they deem to be reasonable, whatever they deem to be acceptable. But every slippery slope towards immorality begins with that. So, listen, when even someone like Yazid killed al-Hussein, when he captures the first thing he tells the surviving women, the women who are captured, the first thing he tells them is, Alhamdulillah, thank Allah, Allah has given victory to al-Haq. So he just killed al-Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, just mutilated his body, just killed. But rarely do people who do wrong tell themselves, I am doing what's wrong and I don't care. Even something as extreme as killing the Prophet's grandson, you philosophize. And most of the time, you philosophize by putting Allah on your side. Rarely, if you're a believer, you rarely say, I don't care what Allah thinks. That's not the common thing. The most common thing is you philosophize Allah to be fine with the way you are, without pushing yourself. I am fine. I am okay. يُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَهُمْ. One of the things that one of my friends who made a living, or he would his main thing is that he would do ruqyas, right? He would go around doing ruqyas. And then he told me that among his biggest clients are officers in Amn al-Dawla, officers in the security forces who torture people. These officers call the sheikh, and he goes to their offices or their homes and he reads Quran on them. And this made me, even at that, these officers, although they will, curse the Prophet as they're torturing people, although they'll say, I am Abu Lahab as they're torturing people, but they have convinced themselves, as remote or far-fetched as it sounds to you, but for them, they've convinced themselves that because they call the sheikh to come read Quran on them, they're not horrible people. They're not terrible. They're okay. That is the nature of human beings. If you are not critical with yourself, then you are covered by this ayah. And I don't care who you are. Tazkiyatun nafs is the most popular ticket, in my belief, what I think, Allahu Alam, but it is the most popular ticket to hellfire. Tazkiyatun nafs. Now, why am I saying all of that? Because all types of people يفترون على الله الكذب. All types of people attribute what are really lies unto God. We do this all the time. Every time you get on social media and you say things that you don't really know, you are lying about God. Every time you are talking about what God's will is when you have not done your homework, you're lying about God. Every time you are pontificating about God's will without due diligence, you're lying about God. Al-iftira' ala Allah kadhib. The people at ISIS who say Allahu Akbar and they slaughter someone, when you say Allahu Akbar and you perpetuate an atrocity, you are يفترون على الله الكذب, right? Because you are saying Allahu Akbar. By saying Allahu Akbar, you're implying that God is happy with what you do. So you say Allahu Akbar and then you execute defenseless people. يفترون على الله الكذب. None of this would have been possible without tazkiyat al-nafs. None of these people do what they do and say, yes, I'm committing a grave sin and I don't care. The reason they're saying Allahu Akbar is because they think that they're what they're doing is actually, but the morality is not structured on tazkiyat al-nafs. Morality is structured, is anchored on self-critical insight, where you are constantly taking yourself to task. Not presumptively right. You might reserve moral judgment with others, but with yourself, you are the most critical. How do we get to someone like Muawiyah as opposed to Ali bin Abi Talib? It is the loss of the critical self. Ali bin Abi Talib, the epitome, or Hassan al-Hussein, the epitome of the critical self. Muawiyah and Yazid, the epitome of a lack of the critical self. Because how else can someone like Ibn Adi, the famous companion who was executed in Muawiyah's era, how? And then some Wahhabi rebels in modern Syria, they went to Ibn Adi's gravesite, and do you know they dug up his body. They defaced his grave. And they were filmed, and they were saying Allahu Akbar as they're defacing the grave of a companion who was executed by the Umayyads 1400 years ago, and no one dared touch his gravesite for 1400 years, and these people yelling Allahu Akbar dug up his grave. Do you see what this ayah is talking about now? That self that says there's nothing wrong with me. I'm reasonable. I'm fine the way I am. What I was talking about in the khutbah, don't I have some rights? Oh, I don't ask for too much. I just ask for just a little bit. And presumes itself to be fine. That self, تفتري على الله الكذب, it is lying about God. But a step further, that is precisely the type of shirk that Allah is talking about. Allah is not talking about those people who are worshipping idols. The context of this ayah is far more troubling. It is saying, watch out who you are worshipping. Because if you are saying you are worshipping God, as these Jews were doing, but in reality, your God is yourself. In reality, when you pray, you are sleepy. You just do your prayer as a matter of a formality. You see, it's all cohesive. And you know, if the law forces you to give people their rights, you give them their rights because the law forces you. But other than that, if you can get away with not giving people their rights, you don't. Allah tells you to take care of orphans and the poor and the wayfarer and so on, and you don't take it too seriously. Oh, I'm not going to give it so much thought. And ultimately, in all of that, you say, I'm fine, I'm a good person. And when you talk or think about God, you take God for granted. That is the shirk. And again, the introduction I started out with, state Islam, the Islam that came from the state, imperial Islam, Umayyad Islam, came to this ayah. And Umayyads, I could tell you stories about how many scholars were persecuted because the Umayyads insisted that this ayah is only talking about idol worshippers. So even when Abu Dharr al-Ghafari, before the Umayyads, Abu Dharr al-Ghafari was exiled during the time of Uthman. When Abu Dharr al-Ghafari insisted that what he is seeing in the rise of materialism in the era of because he was unhappy with how materialistic people had come during the second term of Uthman ibn Affan's government, and he was exiled. He was citing this ayah. And even back then, the state, the aristocracy, the powerful people, were saying, no, we don't want this ayah to be talking about, things that become very uncomfortable like this. That, you're now saying that if we are telling you, because remember, the project of the state wanted to tell you that even if someone ignores all of the Quran, ignores all of the Sunnah of the Prophet, even if someone lets people become homeless and die of hunger and lets corruption run rampant, and as long as he allows you to pray, don't you dare rebel against them. That's the Islam that the state wanted. The state wanted an obedient, subservient Islam. The state wanted to take the revolution out of Islam. So they couldn't, and the state understood very well that when Hussein rebelled, radiallahu anh, understood very well when Muhammad al-Nafs al-Zakiyya rebelled, when Al-Ash'ath rebelled, when Al-Mukhtar rebelled, when Al-Tawwabun or Ta'ibun rebelled, that all of them were accusing the state of shirk. And the state didn't want any of that. None of that. And that's why Surah Nisa is a volcano. It's an earthquake. It's no small thing. It tells you all these rights, but it also tells you that those who are saying, why do we need these reforms? We're good people the way we are the ones who are going to resist these reforms. And of course, everyone that ever kept the dowry that was, everyone that pocketed the dowry paid to his daughter, everyone that married his daughter the way they marry a piece of property, everyone that refused to allow an orphan to inherit, everyone that refused to allow their daughter to inherit. And in all of these situations, they convince themselves that we're doing it because we're good people. We're taking care of everyone. It's not that you don't say, oh, we're thieves, we're disgusting human beings, and we don't care. No, if our daughter needs something, we'll come to her aid. We're good people. And that's the problem. What time is it? I'll go to 9:30. I know we didn't cover a lot of areas, but we've covered doctrinally what is very important. You see, this is, if you want to understand why Muslims are in the state that they're in, it is not an exaggeration to say it's because they've forgotten the Quran, but it's not any Quran. It is the original, pristine, revolutionary message of the Quran. So, what we are talking about is at the heart and core of al-Islam al-Muhammadi, the Islam of the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, the Islam that came and shook the world. Let's take a 2-minute break and then we'll go till 9:30. So, now, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Notice 50, it's انظر, look, كيف يفترون على الله الكذب. Look how they lie about God. وكفى به إثما مبينا, which we've talked about, but when Allah says انظر, it's like saying reflect upon the dynamics by which people lie about God. This is not talking to kuffar. This is talking to believing people, whether these people are Jews or Christians or Muslims, that that when it comes to people of religion, that one of the worst things that people of religion do is turning religion into something that is mundane and secular, not lofty and supernal, not something that truly comes from God, demanding that you elevate, but something that becomes about empowering a class of clergy, or a class of priests, or a class of whoever, a privileged class. It becomes about justifying despotism. It becomes about justifying chauvinism and patriarchy. It becomes about people abusing people. That is giving the lie to God. That is lying about God. And that is why it's such a grave sin. The biggest risk, I wish that it would become elementary to anyone that is thinking about, quote unquote, an Islamic government in the modern age, to think very carefully about how you can create a government that doesn't lie about God. Because that is a grave sin. That is associating partners with God. So you could start out wanting to create an Islamic government, but end up associating partners with God, creating a state that usurps God. Okay, now look at what follows. ألم تر إلى الذين أوتوا نصيبا من الكتاب يؤمنون بالجبت والطاغوت ويقولون للذين كفروا هؤلاء أهدى من الذين آمنوا سبيلا أولئك الذين لعنهم الله ومن يلعن الله فلن تجد له نصيرا أم لهم نصيب من الملك فإذا لا يؤتون الناس نقيرا أم يحسدون الناس على ما آتاهم الله من فضله فقد آتينا آل إبراهيم الكتاب والحكمة وآتيناهم ملكا عظيما. Okay, so here from 50 to 54. First, let me go to Muhammad Asad. again, sake of time. So behold how they attribute their own lying inventions to God, than which there is no sin more obvious. 51. Are thou not aware of those who, having been granted their share of the divine writ, now believe in baseless mysteries and in the powers of evil, and maintain that those who are bent on denying the truth are more surely guided than those who have attained to faith? It is they whom God has rejected, and he whom God rejects shall find none to succor him. Have they perchance a share in God's dominion? And if they had, lo, they would not give to other people as much as would fill the groove of a date stone. 54. Do they perchance envy other people for what God has granted them out of God's bounty? But then we did grant revelation and wisdom unto the house of Abraham, and we did bestow on them a mighty dominion. So this is just the basic translation by Muhammad Asad. Now let's go back again and unpack these verses. So it is one continuing thought and one continuing revelation. 51, after talking, alerting us to those who are lying about God and its relation to shirk. So, ألم تر إلى الذين أوتوا نصيبا من الكتاب يؤمنون بالجبت والطاغوت ويقولون للذين كفروا هؤلاء أهدى من الذين آمنوا سبيلا. So, there is a narration about Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf. Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, who was among the Jewish leaders living in Medina. So in this narration, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf travels to Mecca on some business. And when he's in Mecca, the Meccans come to him and say to him, the Arabic is sort of funny for Joseph, هذا الصنبور المنبتر من قومه. This basically the equivalent of saying, this nobody Muhammad, this nobody uprooted nothing Muhammad claims that he is better than us. So Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf responds and say, no, in fact, you are better than him. And according to this narration, that this is the occasion for the revelation of 51. As I don't think it would surprise you that, yes, I do believe that this event took place, but I don't believe that this was the occasion for revelation. I mean, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, for him to, the Meccans would often have very insulting things to say about the Prophet Muhammad, and to say هذا الصنبور المنبتر is among the least of what they've said. And for Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf to respond to say, yes, you are better than him, that's not surprising. But this is just so you know. Okay. Now, normally, books of interpretation tell you that أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا نَصِيبًا مِنْ كِتَابٍ, that it is talking about Jews and Christians. And it's saying that those Jews and Christians, although they've been given revelation, they continue to believe in Egypt wa Taghut. And normally they'll translate it, or they'll tell you what it means is that although they've received the revelation, they continue to believe in Sihr and Kahanut. They continue to believe in sihr is sorcery, and kahanut in a clergy having semi-divine powers. And so that this ayah is condemning Jews and Christians because they continue to believe in the fiction of sorcery, basically, and they continue to believe that human beings can be endowed with semi-divine powers, that then they represent the divine will and speak for God and so on. But again, revisit the language. Look at the language. It started out by telling us those who've been given a part of the book. This is in 44. And that those who've been given a part of the book, and as we said, that could be Muslims, meaning they received the revelation, but they ended up doing with the revelation they've ended up partaking in what Jews did, and that's mock the Prophet and mock believers and mock people of principle and mock people who are taking this message seriously. The Quran alerts us to a basic moral fallacy, and the moral fallacy is tazkiyat al-nafs, is commending themselves, and that effectively this is lying about God, and that this is a moral failure that plagues Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Then 51, it comes back and says, those who received a part of the revelation, which could be Muslims, Jews, or Christians. Now, what is the problem with those people who are not taking the revelation? Utu nasiban min al-kitab, meaning they don't take the revelation seriously. They take it in part. They listen to the parts they like to listen to. They focus on the parts they want, and they ignore what they want. Okay, what is the problem with them, with those people? The problem is يؤمنون بالجبت والطاغوت. Okay, what is jibt? Although normally in books of interpretation, tafsir, they tell you jibt is sihr. But jibt is not necessarily sorcery. Jibt is any khurafat, any mythology. For you to believe in the paranormal, for you to believe in the non-material, you have to have a basis. What is the basis? Allah is telling you. Why do you believe in angels? Because Allah said there are angels. Why do you believe that there are jinn? Because Allah said there is jinn. Why do you believe in Shaitaan? Because Allah said there's Shaitaan. But for you to believe in things like good omens, bad omens, for you to believe that, in my previous lives, my parents are looking over me and taking care of me. I have a guiding angel. All the things, the mythologies that human beings believe in for comfort, but they're outside your realm of material experience, so that's not the basis for your belief in them, and they're not a part of revelation. That is jibt, khurafat, mythology that is baseless. What taghut? What is taghut? Taghut is dhulm. So they ultimately, their value system doesn't come from God. Their value system, what is the worst form of Jibt and Taghut, are inherited traditions that lead to inequity and injustice. Why do I do it? Because that's the way we've always done it. So why is that right? Just because. That is the real Jibt and Taghut. So it is not about giving anyone their rights. It is not about following all the instructions of Surah An-Nisa about empowering the disempowered, but it is ultimately about those people are resisting the reforms of Surah An-Nisa. Why are they resisting? What is this? Muhammad is coming now and telling us we have to give the dowry to our daughters because our daughters have a right to it. What is this? Muhammad is empowering those, our servants and our workers, and is even forbidding us from referring to our slaves as slaves. And we have to call them fataya and fatati, not abdi and abdadi. What is this? Muhammad is saying they have to eat like from what we eat. They have to wear the same clothes we wear. They have to... What is this? They say they have the right to marriage. Surah An-Nisa produced a lot of opposition. Our nice little storybooks, our little fairy tales about the seerah don't tell us these stories. But Surah An-Nisa came down, a lot of people were unhappy. They were... What is this? Muhammad is telling us, we don't have a right to keep we raise these children as orphans, we will take care of them for the rest of their life. Why do we have to give them their money? Why can't we use their money? Why can't we mix their money? Now I have to separate the money of the orphans from my own money because, normally they would just take and mix all the money and you just invest it as one. It's more money, more economic power. But then Surah An-Nisa came and said, no, you can't mix the money. Their money has to be separate, and you have to present a meticulous accounting for every dime. What is this? And what they wanted to continue doing is precisely a Jibt wa Taghut. No, the way we've been doing things is fine. We were fine. We were fine before this man came and turned our life upside down. So, they are Muslim. They've received the revelation, but they didn't really receive the revelation. They received the revelation, but they don't really believe in the revelation. And who do they often, I'll tell you this just from the narratives, is that who do they go complain to often are the Jews. Because they find a lot of comfort being the opposition one. So, الذين أوتوا نصيبا من الكتاب يؤمنون بالجبت والطاغوت ويقولون للذين كفروا هؤلاء أهدى من الذين آمنوا سبيلا. Now look at this. And I don't know why Quranic commentators just ignore this. Because they're commending themselves, and because they're following their whims and their desires, they reach the point that they think of the الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا, they think about the style of life of the kuffar and say that was a better way of living than what we are being told to do. Do you see the extent of the opposition? This is what the historical record clearly points to. That these people were saying our kufri ways, our pre-Islamic ways were better. And in fact, the way that the Meccans are living and other Arabs who don't have Islam is better. They don't have to concede the rights that we have to concede to people that they didn't want to concede rights to. Women and orphans and low-class people and tribalist people and mawali and all of that. And for these types of people, they are you see, the outside enemy is someone that you can defeat in a battle. But what do you do about the enemy who shares your bed, who comes to Jum'ah and shares your space, but they are not more ideologically, they are constantly a torpedoing the project. And that is why, in the same way that Allah said this form of shirk is shirk that Allah doesn't forgive, what Allah says in 52, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ لَعَنَهُمُ اللَّهُ, because of this, they deserve Allah's curse. They are cursed. Now, differentiate between victory on this earth and being cursed by Allah. Because what is the first thing that when Imam Ali is assassinated, what is the first thing that Muawiyah says? Allah has now shown what is al-haq min al-batil. Muawiyah assumes that because now Ali was assassinated and now he can rule undisputed, that this is the haq. Yazid similarly, when he defeated al-Hussein and killed him, said the same thing. There is a huge difference between la'nat al-akhirah, being thoroughly cursed, and victory on this earth. Just because you end up with all the trappings of success on this earth has nothing to do with whether, in fact, what it is your moral conduct that will indicate whether you're cursed or not whether you succeed on the material indicators on this earth. أم لهم نصيب من الملك فإذا لا يؤتون الناس نقيرا. Now 53, notice 53 is the way it is translated, which is normally the way you find it in tafsir. Have they perchance a share in God's dominion? Okay. But if they had, lo, they would not give to other people as much as would fill the grove of a date stone. أم لهم نصيب من الملك. If it was up to them, Allah is sort of exposing their immorality. Which actually Muhammad Asad sort of gets it very close, but anyway. That if it was up to them, if they were left to their own moral devices, they would in fact be even more unjust than they already are. This is a very dangerous slippery slope, or a very, very dangerous trajectory. Allah intervenes often to force at least a measure of equity in the midst of human injustices. Because if it was truly, if Allah didn't, and people would be left to their own devices when it comes to mulk, to power, and Allah wouldn't balance the power of one against the other, human beings would be capable of reaching the point where they wouldn't even give as much as a date, or even a pit of a date, to their fellow human being. Why? Because of this, that immorality that Allah identifies tazkiyat al-nafs and thinking well of yourself regardless, and tazkiyat al-nafs, and what was the other one? Oh, and believing in the Jibt wa Taghut, that you are ultimately. So, listen. In our day and age, okay, a good percentage of the people that inhabit the countries of Saudi, Bahrain, the Emirat, their origins are from Yemen. Tribally, they're from Yemen. So many human beings are fully aware that there are millions of Yemenis dying from starvation. But they exist in perfect harmony with themselves, thinking that they're good Muslims. They'll even go to Umrah and Hajj and pray and everything and nothing. And it doesn't bother them that their state is responsible for the starvation and death and murder of millions of human beings that are their own ancestors. Don't the Egyptians help the Israelis create a huge concentration camp for the Gazans, the Palestinians? Egyptians are fully aware that the Gazans can't import anything, can't get food, can't get water, can't get work, because of the way that the Israelis suffocate the Gazans. But ask how many Egyptians thinks, I'm going to go to hellfire because of what I allow my government to do to the Gazans. Most Egyptians, in fact, support their government. It's not inconsistent. You see what this is what the Quran is talking about. I read this, it's an incredible story, but an officer in the Egyptian army, there was a bus packed with Palestinians coming back from Hajj. Because of a bureaucratic mistake, this officer, knowing that this is a bureaucratic mistake, but because he didn't want to run the risk of being censored by his superiors, opened fire at this bus of pilgrims and killed every single Palestinian pilgrim on board. He had one of these big machine guns, the stationary machine guns, ordered the soldiers to open fire on the bus, reloaded and finished the clip, and killed every single, and because he followed procedure, he was even promoted. This officer is supposedly a religious guy who doesn't miss a prayer in the masjid. How do you make sense of that? This man murdered 30 Palestinians coming back from Hajj for a mere bureaucratic technicality. And he refuses the idea that he even committed a sin. You see, Shaitaan doesn't come and tell you commit a sin. Shaitaan comes and tells you you're being still a good Muslim when you commit a sin. What you're still a good person. You're still a good Muslim. So what? Come on, the people who are saying, they're asking you to sacrifice too much. They're asking you to give too much. What is this? This is unreasonable. Don't you have rights? This is the way Shaitan comes. If we comprehend this whole state of the miserable state of Muslims in the world today would change. But this would also require that we rid ourselves of, the imperial Islam that killed the spirit of Islam, that took the Islam out of Islam. Okay. Now, and then this idea is completed with 54. What prevents moral elevation? What truly prevents people from morally elevating? And the idea here is remarkable. أم يحسدون الناس على ما آتاهم الله من فضله فقد آتينا آل إبراهيم الكتاب والحكمة وآتيناهم ملكا عظيما. The simple idea of human beings saying, well, if this is a morally superior path, why would this person have it? In other words, your resistance to moral elevation is often a personality clash. Nothing more. You resist the idea that, well, why should my path to morality go through this person? Precisely the problem that a lot of the folks that followed Abdullah ibn Ubay, it is not even that they had a principal disagreement with anything. And it's not even if they accepted the personality of the Prophet, even if they accepted the Prophet as a teacher. But the idea of me accepting someone like Abdurrahman ibn Auf, or someone like Bilal, or someone like Salman al-Farisi, these mawali, they're going to teach me something? So you want me to be like them? I'm supposed to listen to them? And this is the venue that Shaitan comes from. Oh, well, this person just wants to show off. This person just wants to tell you that they're better than you. It is not about anything moral, anything ethical. It's just about this person wants to, and this is precisely why Allah says, envy what Allah has given people. It's not talking about material grants. That's not the hasad that the ayah is talking about. And that is why it then tells you, well, listen, the whole way morality works, remember that for reasons that you will never understand, Allah gave wisdom and knowledge and insight to Ibrahim. This is where the story began. And from Ibrahim, it reached you. Now, if you want to persist with the question of, well, why should I defer to anyone else? Why should I'm fine the way I am, and if I listen to XYZ, then that hurts my ego. It's a non-starter. Because it started way long before you. And in fact, that is the nature of sages. And Allah doesn't speak to human beings directly. Allah speaks to human beings through human beings. And it is your ability to get beyond the self, beyond yourself, to focus on the moral principle itself, that might be your salvation and might prevent you from falling into shirk. Okay, this is a good place to stop. It is a revolution. And the people who received it understood Surah Nisa as a revolution. But it was escalating the tensions with those who refused to sign onto the Islamic project, as we will see, escalated after Surah Nisa. Because now the sacrifices were not just go to war, where there's a possibility at least of spoils. I mean, it was a blow bad enough that you couldn't just rob whoever you kill. Now, the spoils went to the state, and the state distributed them, etc., etc. But now, those that being a part of the Muhammadan society was part of an entire program of sacrifice. And that was demanding. And it is no surprise, because, you get this question a lot of, oh, well, why is it that after the death of the Prophet there were the apostasy wars? Because there were a lot of people that had converted, but Islam had not entered their heart. And it was hard. And the minute the Prophet died, a lot of people said, oh, great. We don't need to do all these sacrifices anymore. The man who sort of made us feel like we just through his moral authority made us afraid to rebel and to say we won't play anymore is dead. So, khalas, it's over. But, if it's not demanding, then you don't need Allah. If Allah's presence in our life is not a demanding presence, then what is the point of acknowledging Allah? Is Allah supposed to be just, another venue of entertainment, or just relieving some pressure, just like among the other forms of distraction in life? Or is Allah truly our anchor and our guide and our path and our goal and our entire qibla, our entire everything? Okay, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Let's stop here.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This as a continuation even of the power of the khutbah yesterday. I mean, one of the things that I really love is that I've noticed that when we're covering certain surahs, that you bring it into the khutbah, and you really help us understand. Even yesterday, you were saying, it's one thing to understand the principle that God is trying to teach us, but it's another thing to actually put it into practice. And so it's so powerful to go through Surah Nisa and see these examples. But today it was just so rich, and I think like oftentimes, part of the power of these halakas is we start understanding the full picture of things. Like, I mean, I can speak for myself as a convert, like the messages that I would get about Islam or, you know, the Quran through just, typical mainstream experiences leaves so much unsaid. And when you sit down and you understand then the context of what the early Muslims were going through, what the Prophet experienced, the resistance, even just understanding like the differences in people who started with the Prophet, from the beginning and learned so much through sacrifice to the range of people who came later and where they were. I mean, it helps us understand our experience because it's so human. And, I think that when you really take the time to teach us about, truly the depth and the nuance of the entire context and picture, it gives you just so much more understanding. You have aha moments, and then you understand why taking the Quran seriously is something that really makes all the difference in your faith, in your conviction, in your understanding of things. And so this surah, or this halakha today, was so powerful at so many levels. Even just understanding that the science of transmission, for example, is biased, right? And that that you have to take into account, what was the context, how did the people who chose and report on certain hadith, what were their tendencies, what was said, who was left out of the picture, why do we have so many more reports from certain types of people versus, even the grandsons of the Prophet. These are things that we never think about or even understand or, know could have an impact on what we've inherited now after all of these years. So to even understand that that's something that we should be thinking about is a tool that we can, discern with, which is so powerful. And knowing then the distinction, for example, between imperialist Islam versus Quranic Islam, which I think you talked about also in the khutbah yesterday. And, we can translate this into what we understand today and the impact of power and how people who have the wealth, the money, the influence, the political influence, how they configure the things that we deal with in our life and what their preferences are, what their influences are, and that took place within our own tradition. So we have this Islam that we inherited that is imperialist, that comes from, the Qurayshi aristocracy, and how that was handed down, and how it's so distinct from the Quranic Islam that calls for, hardship, sacrifice. The idea, the imperialist Islam thinking of it in a narrow term versus the Quranic Islam, which is extremely expansive and all of the potential that could be mined. You get a little bit angry when you start seeing how much potential was in the Quran that was actually even squashed from the first century, from this imperialist Islam. The idea of, I just threw down some other ideas, just the empowering message of living your life knowing that you are witnessing for others and you are being witnessed, and the transformative impact of that idea and how we really haven't been taught that as Muslims. The idea of, we are fine, we are good, and lying to oneself and versus being critical of oneself. There's just so much here, and I think you just continue to emphasize how important it is to, as a student of the Quran, have commitment, seriousness, and sacrifice. And we're so influenced in our time, and maybe even then, by the idea of comfort and, this is too hard, and how, you even pointed out Shaitaan comes in and offers an alternative Islam that says, oh, this is too much, you're good, this is enough. I mean, we see that so clearly in our time, and, and it's such a sobering idea to think of ourselves that, okay, are we being too soft on ourselves? And, are we not being critical enough? And even what you said, what happens when God is giving us this message to believing people, and what happens when your enemies, people who are not on the same program as you, people who don't share the same value system as you, are the same people that come to your mosque or share, your family with you. I mean, these are things that I'm sure a lot of us wonder about when we look around, at other Muslims that we reach out to, who, we talk to, we ask for help with, people that should care about the Uyghurs, should care about, things that are happening in our world, and we don't get that same traction. So it's just as vibrant, these messages for our time and how we deal with, our own situation today. I mean, I think it's all a part of this, taking the Quran seriously, making the Quran come alive for our day, and it's so invaluable. So anyway, thank you so much for this incredible session, and there's so much to think about, so much to reflect on and continue to study. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Thank you for being with us. I'm excited and sad that we have to wait another week for another installment. But anyway, it's
just maybe
incredible.
pray for a miracle. I don't know
So.
how it would happen, but
Alhamdulillah.
okay.
Thank you so
Assalamu alaikum.
much. Assalamu alaikum. Have a great week. Inshallah, we'll see you next week.